In the late 1930s, the photographer Gordon Parks arrived in Washington, D.C. to work with Roy Stryker, director of the Farm Security Administration. Parks's first assignment was to tour the nation's capital, a city still governed by Jim Crow laws. Stryker locked Parks's camera in a closet and then bade the young black man adieu, with the expectation Parks would not return for a week. Before the day ended, Parks angrily returned to Stryker and demanded his camera. In the showdown that followed, Stryker taught Parks a basic lesson about photography. You can't take a picture of a white salesman, waiter, or ticket seller and just say they are prejudiced. That isn't enough. You've got to verbalize the experience first, then find logical ways to express it in pictures. After that, Parks articulated his arguments in essays and books, then used his camera as a weapon, teaching that racism and poverty were created not by divine providence, but by people, and hence could be solved by people.
This is how Tammy Horn, former humanities professor at Berea College, starts her essay, The Graphic Novel as a Choice of Weapon. What interests Horn in this story is the insistence that it is not images alone, but the crafted combination of both pictures and words that is able to create a coherent political message. In Horn's view, the comic medium, built as it is with that union as its foundation, is thus particularly suited for the task of propaganda. Here, we use propaganda in the neutral sense of spreading an idea, and not in the more modern negative sense of lying manipulation. Horn goes on to describe her experiences teaching works like Jack Jackson's Comanche Moon, Judd Winnick's Pedro and Me, and Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis and Persepolis II, arguing that comic books can serve as teaching tools which raise the political consciousness of their readers. She writes,
Graphic novels can be a weapon in social justice pedagogy precisely because they verbalize discrimination and then illustrate such practices in logical sequences for younger readers.
Horn was far from the first person to realize this. Even before comic books as we know them came into existence, political cartoons employed the combination of words and pictures to spread messages on social issues. Early comic strips were also no stranger to this practice. For example, as Jeremy Dauber explains in American Comics: A History, you could say Little Orphan Annie fought for capitalism against the quasi-socialist specter of that man in the White House. In a 1932 run, Annie takes a job from a striker, noting, if he doesn't want to work for decent wages, okay, but he's got no right to keep anyone else from taking the job. Unsurprisingly, Gray, the strip's creator, advocated for the abolition of unions. Henry Ford cabled his enthusiasm for the strip in 1933. And look, I know it's not cool to victim blame or, kick someone when they're down, but have we ever thought that maybe Annie was orphaned because she fucking sucked ass and her parents could tell the vibes were off? But I digress. As comic strips gave way to comic books, the medium remained a premier site for political messaging. This is something American government officials and lobbyists even picked up on. During World War II, the main domestic propaganda organization in the United States, the Writers' War Board, actively collaborated with companies in the new comic book industry to produce wartime propaganda material. According to Paul Hirsch's book, Pulp Empire, the WWB was drawn to comic books for four main reasons. They were popular enough to reach a large audience, lowbrow enough that no one would suspect them of government propaganda, and their readership included a lot of the young men who were serving in the war effort. And finally, to quote from Hirsch,
WWB members appreciated the combination of simple text and images within comic books, which seemed to make the medium almost universally comprehensible. In 1944, the Journal of Educational Sociology devoted an entire issue to the idea that comic books possessed an overlooked means of educating Americans unwilling or unable to learn through more conventional methods. WWB members agreed that messages embedded within comics were more enjoyable and effective than overt, moralistic proselytizing.
Due to these perceived advantages, the American establishment went all in on comic books. They became part of the war strategy. The result was that, to quote Hirsch again, nearly half of all soldiers and sailors regularly consumed comic books, and the Navy classified comics alongside water, food, and ammunition as essential supplies for the Marines stationed on Midway Island. These soldiers brought their comic books with them when they were deployed, and that of course included those soldiers deployed in the Pacific theater of the war. Thus, when comic books were first introduced to the Japanese public en masse, it was largely in the form of wartime propaganda. The artists who initiated the golden age of manga were directly inspired by those books. From the very beginning of modern manga, it was a socially conscious medium. To be clear, the comic medium absolutely existed in Japan prior to the war. It was just usually in the form of political cartoons and short strips in magazines. What we might properly call comic books didn't even exist in America until the 1930s, and there wasn't really an equivalent in Japan. Manga as we know it in the modern day, with multi-chapter or multi-volume stories published in book form, didn't exist, but people were still matching sequential drawings to words. Before shonen manga, there were shonen magazines, and many of these magazines published comic strips within their pages. The comics were meant to appeal to the entertainment sensibilities of boys, but they also frequently contained educational or instructional material. After Japan launched their attack on China and began World War II, these magazines were increasingly used for wartime propaganda purposes, and that included a shift in the content of the comic strips, favoring militaristic and nationalistic themes, and featuring figures like samurais as symbols of Japanese power. So when shonen manga emerged in its modern form in the years after the war, it did so with these politically inclined strips as part of its lineage. Osamu Tezuka's Mighty Atom, released as Astro Boy in the US, was influenced by both of these traditions. On the one hand, Tezuka, a huge fan of Disney and Superman, pulled from the comic books introduced to Japan by soldiers from the West. On the other, he took inspiration from the comic strips he read growing up, works like Suiho Tagawa's Norakuro. After kickstarting the golden age of manga with his 1947 work New Treasure Island, Tezuka basically invented the modern shonen in 1952 with Mighty Atom. He used that book to attack all kinds of social issues and political hot topics, particularly focusing on anti-war and pro-environment themes. He also picked up pro-environment and animal rights issues in the shonen series Jungle Emperor, released in the West as Kimba the White Lion, where he even advocates for vegetarianism, something he would do often throughout his career. Not only did Tezuka use his shonen manga to explore political ideas, he also lent his characters to political causes. For example, in the January 29, 1967 issue of Red Flag, the national newspaper for the Japanese Communist Party, Tezuka drew a piece opposing the US invasion of Vietnam and supporting the Vietnamese communist militants, which features characters from Mighty Atom and the phrase, "Atom is with you." That's right, Astro Boy was a filthy red. Tezuka himself was a member of the Japanese Communist Party at the time, though he was ultimately more of a radical liberal sympathizer than a dedicated Marxist. I think he would have been cooler if he had been a dedicated Marxist, but that's neither here nor there. All of that is to say that there has been a long-standing belief in both America and Japan that comic books are an important medium for both the exploration of political themes and for educating young people about staying alert and getting involved. From the beginning of the comics medium, political issues are there, and, of particular importance to One Piece, the idea that shonen manga may be used to affect political change is right there at the beginning of modern shonen manga. It's clear that Oda sees his work as part of this lineage. Perhaps no ultra-mainstream shonen manga since Mighty Atom has been so preoccupied with issues of social justice and liberation. I mean, that's mostly what this YouTube channel has been all about so far. Every arc, Oda feels the need to talk about problems like food sovereignty, the right to healthcare, or the evils of racism. It's also obvious that the manga is supposed to be somewhat instructional to his young readers. He's too subtle and mature as a writer to just put the words, "bigotry is bad," in big letters across the page, but every time you see a bigot, Oda uses them as an example of what not to be, and the characters he uses as examples of good people, ideals to strive to, are figures like the Straw Hats, who embrace others for their differences and are willing to put their lives on the line for the liberation of oppressed groups. Oda even presents something of a model for political change. It is the result of a collective effort, not only on the part of a vanguard like the Straw Hats, but also because of the actions of the masses. Political change comes from the community. Also, it is violent. Naruto may be able to talk his way out of a fight, but that doesn't work in the world of One Piece. The battles in Naruto are all psychological. In One Piece, they are political, and political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Or a gum-gum pistol. Oda isn't just writing about political topics, he's trying to encourage his readers to think about them, especially his young readers. He wants us to get involved. He's using shonen manga not only as a source of entertainment, but also, in the words of Tammy Horn, as a weapon in social justice pedagogy. Shonen manga is the medium in which Oda has chosen to wage his political struggle, to try to get his message out. This has been obvious to the intelligent reader for well over a decade at this point, but with the introduction of Gear 5 a few years ago, it reached something of a crescendo. Gear 5 has two defining features. Firstly, Luffy's Nika form is one that inspires others towards acts of revolution. Chapter 1044, where the form is first introduced, is literally titled Warrior of Liberation. It represents the explicit transformation of Luffy into a revolutionary figure. Secondly, Gear 5 grants Luffy Toon Force, the ability to manipulate himself and his surroundings as if he is a cartoon character. Kaido even remarks upon seeing it that it's like something from a comic strip. The combination of these two ideas gives us the heart of the message behind Gear 5. Luffy is a comic book character who is leading others towards revolution. But also, in real life, Luffy is a comic book character who is leading others towards revolution. It's an incredibly meta idea for a shonen power-up. Luffy's power within the story is also his power in the real world. His symbolic ability is also his literal ability. Oda is spelling it all out for you. He believes in the political power of the comic medium so much that he turned the comic medium into the ultimate political weapon. This is also why the moment when Bonnie models herself after Gear 5 on Egghead is so important. There was a lot of controversy about it when it happened because some people thought it cheapened the form if other characters could use it. This couldn't be further from the truth. The fact the form can be shared makes it more, not less, meaningful. Bonnie's abilities allow her to transform into any future version of herself she can imagine. When she looks at Luffy in his Nika form, she begins to imagine herself as a warrior of liberation. Luffy does for Bonnie what Oda hopes he is doing for the young people reading his manga. He inspires her to become a freedom fighter, to strike down her oppressors. This carries additional weight if you remember that Oda has daughters not too far from Bonnie's age, and Egghead Island is an arc particularly focused on the perils of being a girl dad. Oda has written a story in which Luffy, the shonen manga character, inspires a girl his daughter's age to imagine a better future. A future that is better because in it, she is fighting for what is right. She is fighting like Luffy. Hopefully, one day, we all will.